Polytunnels are a very high-value growing space, especially in the climate that we have here in Ireland, but they are expensive enough to put up. And like all gardens, it's important to continue to improve the growing conditions and soil fertility. And over the years, I've learned that it's definitely worth putting in the extra effort and resources in order to be able to get the most out of the initial investment of this protected growing space. With my older, slightly smaller polytunnel, I've had a continual rotation of crops year-round, so that there's always something growing, which means that I tend to amend the growing beds in sections as they're emptied of one crop and before another crop goes in. But in my newer polytunnel, I didn't manage to plant any overwintering crops last year, which had the advantage of giving me a clear space to work in so that all of the preparation work for the season can be done at once. So, over the last few weeks, we've put in the effort to clear the space, amend the soil, make some improvements to the infrastructure so that this polytunnel space can be made ready for the new growing season. Four years ago, I put up this polytunnel on rough ground that took a lot of work and some help with ground cover fabric to manage. But I got a good results in the first season of growth. The second season started with too many weeds, fertility issues, and problematic diseases, so I decided to abandon the crops and to work on improving the soil before growing anything again. Later in that same season, the plastic of this polytunnel was severely damaged when the adjacent compost facility burned down, so I ended up replacing the plastic, re-establishing the beds, and sowing and overwintering green manure. After working in the green manure in the following spring and recovering with ground cover fabric, I was able to get a reasonable crop in 2019. To start the season last year, I decided to manage the fixed beds with minimal cultivation or a version of no-dig, and I remineralized the soil and covered the beds with a thick layer of compost. Last year, I was able to get a large harvest of spring and hungry gap crops, as well as an abundance from the summer and autumn. So 2021 started with the gardens in reasonably good conditions, and we had the time over the winter to do the work at clearing out the remains of last year's crop, apart from a few parsley plants that seemed worth keeping for a few months of production into the spring. And the first job, after clearing out all of the plants and weeds, was to redefine the edges of the fixed beds with twine stretched between two stakes at either end. And although this took a bit of time to set up, it makes the rest of the work in this growing space a bit easier. The main addition to this garden again this season was to spread a generous layer of compost over the surface of all the beds. I have joined in with a local community farm to order a large truckload of finished compost, and it's been great having this resource of clean, weed-free, and easy-to-manage organic material. Moving this volume of material is a fair amount of work, and the pile is about 100 meters away from the polytunnel. But I've found that the easiest and most convenient way to do this job is to load the compost into buckets that are then set into a cart and hauled down the path to the polytunnel. It is then easy to use the buckets to spread the relatively free-flowing material and to get a fairly even distribution over the beds. And I find this is a lot faster and easier than shoveling compost into a wheelbarrow. We ended up adding a total of 2.5 cubic meters of compost as a base layer, giving a depth of compost of about 30 millimeters or 1¼ inch, once raked out evenly over the surface of the 80 square meters of growing beds. I think that this is a reasonably generous amount of compost to add each year, and close to the recommendations from other growers, but I haven't done any real explorations to figure out what might be an ideal amount. Before I added the compost to the surface of the soil, I had taken an overall soil sample from this garden, and I plan to use the results of a detailed soil test to continue the process of remineralizing and balancing the soil. But I have been delayed in getting it sent off to the lab. So until I get the results, I've added a base layer of concentrated fertility amendments, including 10 kilograms of chicken manure pellets, to top up a lot of the main nutrients, which works out at about 125 grams per square meter of growing bed. I also added 2.5 kilograms of seaweed for trace elements, and a smaller amount of sulfur as a key mineral that I have found to be in short supply in these soils. All of this was spread over the top of the compost, as I feel that this compost that we brought in was not so rich or fertile, and could benefit from being amended as well. And a lot of the fertility will wash down into the soil and hopefully be distributed by worms and other soil biology through the topsoil. I then covered the beds with an additional thin layer of compost so that the amendments were not on the surface, and this brought the total amount of compost added to about 3 cubic meters, resulting in a depth of about 40 millimeters or 1.5 inches. When the results of the soil test come back, I suspect that it will show a deficiency of phosphorus and a few other trace elements like boron, copper, and zinc. And I'll probably amend these later in the spring with a side dressing or dissolved in water and sprinkled over the beds. No doubt I will be foliar feeding and liquid feeding some of the plants during the growing season, and I might even side dress with additional compost and fertility at some point. But I think that this initial addition of fertility and compost will provide enough food for the soil and plants for most of the growing season. With all the compost added, the surface of the bed raised even further above the level of the fixed paths, which I filled in with wood chip, partially to prevent the compost from falling off the edge of the bed. I've used other types of wood chip in the past, but this time I was able to salvage decomposing wood chip and sawdust from the base of the hopper of our district heating system, which had gotten wet at one point and was starting to decay. This material had lots of fungal mycelia in it, and a few months exposed to the winter rain accelerated the decomposition process. I was able to add a bit more than 1 cubic meter of wood chip to the paths, which produced a layer of about 30 millimeters deep, which will keep the soil moist, suppress any weeds, and provide a much cleaner surface to walk on. And over time, this abundance of carbon will decompose further and feed the soil, and no doubt I will top up the paths with more wood chip next season. During all this work, I decided to leave the network of dripline pipes in place, rather than pulling all the pipes to the side or out of the polytunnel completely. I wasn't sure how much they would get in the way, but the thick layer of compost that was added initially was enough to temporarily bury the pipes. I did think about keeping them buried in the compost for the full growing season, but I noticed that with the contraction and expansion as the pipes heated and cooled in the sun, they pulled out of the compost anyway. In hindsight, it would have been a bit easier if I'd done all the work in a short period of time to get it finished before the pipes started to move a bit, as it was a bit of a hassle to rake the beds flat when they were no longer buried in the soil. I tested the dripline system and flushed out the pipes in case any debris had gotten in, and then taped up the ends again. I found one hole in one of the pipes, and I'm not sure how I made it, but it was easy enough to fix with tape as this is a system of leaky pipes anyways, so an additional leak is not an issue so long as it isn't too big. Once all of the amendments were added to the beds, we pulled out the dripline pipes so that they could lay on the surface of this compost, and any of the disturbed compost could be easily leveled by hand before sowing the crops. The main improvement that I made to the infrastructure of this growing space this season was to install a sprinkler system, in addition to the dripline system, for watering the plants and the soil. There are benefits and issues to both of these watering systems, but I have experience in my other polytunnel that they complement each other quite well. The sprinklers are very useful for watering the entire space of the garden, which helps in the spring when the polytunnel is full of lots of small, fast-growing salad-type crops. And the dripline system works well for watering without increasing the humidity of the space too much, especially when taller crops like tomatoes will get in the way of the sprinklers. These sprinklers are a useful example of a complete system that has been designed for easy installation, and although the systems like this can be expensive, it is going to save time and effort over quite a few years and hopefully result in better crops, so I think it is worth the investment. I put in 2 lines of sprinklers down the length of the polytunnel, with the pipes hung from the polytunnel frame on simple wires, which allowed me to set them at whatever height I wanted. One issue that I have to take into consideration was the fact that there is currently quite low water pressure and flow on the site due to a blocked pipe, but we anticipate this being fixed in the next few months. And from my experience with my other polytunnel, the current pressure of the water would not be enough to effectively run the full line of 15 sprinklers, and definitely not the 2 lines of 30 sprinklers. To get around this temporary issue, I installed a valve to split each of the lines into 2, and installed a connector at either end of each pipe. So, for the next few months, I can effectively water 1/4 of the polytunnel space at a time, and simply connect the hose to each pipe end in turn to water the full space. Once better water pressure is established, I can leave the valves open, connect the 2 pipes together, and join them in with the dripline network. So then I only need to use a valve to switch between the 2 systems. And I'll probably end up installing a timer to make the regular tasks of watering even easier. The thick layer of compost and wood chip will prevent a lot of the existing weed seeds in the soil from germinating, and weeding is definitely becoming less of an issue in this growing space. Last year, I added the layer of compost a few weeks later in the season, and I found that a lot of the weed seeds had already started to germinate and ended up coming up through the compost. We will see if the same thing happens again this year, but I expect that it'll be a lot less because the soil hasn't been cultivated underneath the compost, so a new batch of dormant weed seeds hasn't been brought closer to the surface of the soil, and we have prevented any weeds from dropping any new seeds in this space. I've also cleared out most of the perennial weed roots over the past few years, but there are still a few patches of creeping thistle and scotchgrass and a bit of bindweed on the edges. I need to be persistent in pulling out any growth that does appear in order to continue to weaken the roots and prevent them from becoming established again. This year, I also need to put in the effort to clear out the area around the outside perimeter of the polytunnel, as some of these roots can find their way back in under the buried plastic. Eventually, if I keep up this kind of management, this will be a largely weed-free growing space, which will significantly reduce the amount of work that I need to put in. The final thing that we need to do to prepare this growing space for the season is to finish washing the inside and outside of the polytunnel plastic. The main purpose of this is to allow as much sunlight as possible to get into the growing space, but also to reduce the risk of any mold, spores, and other diseases spreading to the crops. And I also suspect that it will help the polytunnel plastic last longer, but I'm not so sure about that. We generally use a soft brush or a broom and a hose to clean the inside of the plastic, but we also use a wet towel attached to ropes that can be pulled back and forth over the outside surface of the polytunnel. This is one of the few jobs in the gardens that is easiest to do when it is raining quite a bit, but a hose works as well, and I'm going to try to do this cleaning several times during the growing season, as I suspect this will be better and easier than leaving it to only once a season. It's great to get this polytunnel ready for the new growing season, but there's still a bit of work to do in clearing all the vegetation from around the outside of the structure, reworking the water system once the pressure improves, and adding additional amendments and fertility once the soil test results come back. But it is ready for planting, and I've already started sowing a succession of fast-growing crops for spring and early summer harvest. I've also planted some strawberry plants in part of one of the beds, which will stay in place for at least a full year to see how they produce in this enclosed space compared to the outside gardens. But most of the garden will be planted up with warm season crops again by the summer. And this year I plan to sow some overwintering crops after the main warm season crops are finished, in order to have an abundance to harvest at this time next year. But before I do those late sowings, I will probably add another layer of compost to the surface of the soil and do another round of cleaning, preparation, and amendments so that I can continue the process of gradual improvements to get the most out of this high-value growing space.